What is Papakāinga and how does it differ from a normal housing development? I live outside my rohe. I don't really want to go home. What are my options? You know, I really love this vibe, but actually I'm Pākehā. Can I get on Papakāinga too? Tēnā koutou, ko Jade katoa ingoa, no ngā pahi ahau. I'm an architect and I'm also a senior lecturer here at AUT. I'm going to talk to you today about Kāinga. This is Kāinga Matters. Okay, so for our first question, what's the difference between a kāinga, a papakāinga, and just a normal housing development? For kāinga, pre-European contact and pre-colonization, there were three main forms of settlement. There was kāinga, which is our village. There was pā, which is a fortified village. And then there were seasonal encampments associated with fishing and other cultivation and food activities. And so when we think about papakāinga, it's made up of two components. So papa, which is derived from papa tuanuku, which is the ancestral earth mother. And then there's kāinga, which is the ancestral village. So if we think about papakāinga in a contemporary sense, generally it's a housing development or a village that will also have non-housing functions, such as, you know, shared gardens, shared laundries, shared anything else. And it's generally people who whakapapa or have genealogical connections to that land and to each other. I think we all know what a normal housing development is, but the main real difference is that, one, the people are from there, the people are related to one another, and there's often an explicit kaupapa around revitalizing language and cultural practices. Okay, so for our next question, Hundies for Papakāinga, but how do I stop my auntie from coming over to talk to me every day right when I'm about to leave for work? Love that question because, you know, as much as we love our whānau, you know, sometimes we've got different time scales, different priorities. One of the real benefits of Papakāinga is that you're able to kind of live together as a whānau, have that bump space, that interactions, be able to support one another. But I think if your Papakāinga is well designed, then there should be that good separation between kind of public, shared space and more of that private space. And you should be able to kind of maybe get a straight line out of your house and out of the kāinga without, you know, being late for work. And so I guess I'd put it down to good design, maybe a bit of a management. Maybe you need to have a quiet word to auntie and say, auntie, you know I start work at 9. So for our next question, what's pepper potting and what's it got to do with kāinga? Okay, so this is an interesting question. So a little bit of historical context. Post-World War II, we had a real push for Māori to shift from rural areas into urban centres. There was a few reasons for that. One, the cities needed the labour force. Also, there was a desire for that rural land to be, you know, used differently, perhaps by others. And also because we had the World War and we had a hollowing out of young men who could work that land, a lot of our kāinga and our rural land really struggled, like who's going to run the farm because there's nobody around. And so there was this push. A lot of whānau moved to urban centres such as Tāmaki Makaurau, and often they were encouraged into mixed developments, perhaps social or public housing developments that would explicitly pepper pot families. And the goal of that was so that there would be cultural assimilation. And there's even booklets from that era which are really wild that say, here's how to be a good neighbour. And, you know, here's how to be a good neighbour within this Pākehā neighbourhood. And don't do those Māori things because that's not being a good neighbour. And so there were, I guess, some positives perhaps around social cohesion, but the real negative is that it was social cohesion at the cost of Māori culture. And the intention was that Māori would live more like Pākehā rather than we would all understand one another better and live harmoniously together. I don't want to move back home. There are no jobs and it's full of old people. Can Papakāinga be not on whānau land? He pātai pai tērā. So there's a few parts to this. So one, I acknowledge that a lot of whenua Māori or Māori ancestral land that is still retained in whānau and hapū ownership is often in rural areas, and most of that land is not well serviced by infrastructure. There's not necessarily jobs. And so if you're wanting to return to your ancestral lands, you might have to bring a job with you, or you might need to be part of collaboratively working with your whānau, hapū and iwi to create economic opportunities. There's some really great stuff happening around the country where iwi are leading the way in creating jobs for whānau, but acknowledge that's a real consideration and a real concern. The second part of that is, you know, can I have a papakāinga that's not on my ancestral lands? And so, yes and no. So the word Papakāinga we generally reserve for housing developments and village kind of living that is on ancestral lands. but we're seeing some really great Papakāinga style developments emerge. So I'll use as one example, there's a really fabulous trust located close to Taupo. Now, they have been supporting housing developments on whenua Māori in their rohe. They've also been doing housing development in Rotorua for whānau who live there. And more recently, they've developed a apartment building. And that's also for their descendants and their tribal members who live there. And so while still approaching that respectfully with mana whenua or those who hold mana whenua status in the rohe, the idea is that their tribal members, they're meeting them where they're at. There might not be the employment at home, or they might not be ready to move home, or they might have been there for multiple generations. And so they're going, well, okay, our whānau are there, we'll go to them. And I think that's a really valid response. And so you can have Papakāinga style developments outside of your ancestral lands, but we generally take or reserve the Papakāinga word for those that are within the ancestral rohe. I can't afford a house. How do I get in on this? Okay, well, I also can't afford a house, and I would also like one. So this is a great question. Let me share my thoughts on it. So there's a few things. I think first, let's acknowledge that it's a structural issue. We have a huge problem where home ownership's really unaffordable. And for previous generations, it was accessible, but for kind of my generation and the generation that follows, it's very hard for us. There's not a lot of opportunities. And I think we all collectively have the responsibility of working on this structural problem. Setting that aside, as an individual or as a whānau that are just trying to get into housing, trying to get into permanent, secure, safe housing where they can raise their whānau and live really community-connected lives, there are a few options. So one of the ones that I think is really worth talking about is shared equity or progressive home ownership. And so this is generally run by community housing providers. And what they will do is they'll do a development. They'll put it out to whānau that meet a criteria, which will usually be kind of an income bracket. And they're really looking for working whānau who can pay rent regularly. They've got a good track record and they could be supported into home ownership, but they're not too attractive to the bank and they probably couldn't get a mortgage or they can't quite get a deposit together. And so how it works is that you pay rent. Well, this is one of the models. So one of the ways it can work is you pay rent for 5 years at an agreed rate. At the end of that time, you have the option to capitalize on your 5 years of rent to be your deposit for that dwelling. And I just think what a great model that should be available to all of us, right? So few and far between, unfortunately, but I think that's a really good way to get into housing while we work on the trickier, long-term, thorny structural stuff. So for those of us that whakapapa Māori, how do we find out if our iwi or hapū are developing housing, and how do we get in on that? Okay, so good question. There's a couple of different avenues. So if you're a member of an iwi, then make sure you're registered with your iwi entities. One of my iwi is Ngāti Whakauē, and we've actually got maybe 5 or 6 entities, so it can be a little bit of a tricky job, but it's worth doing your homework. And then once you find out that information, share it around with your whānau, tell your sister, tell your brother, tell your kids, and make sure that everyone gets registered if you're not already. Some of the opportunities that might come up is, I know some of my iwi have done housing needs surveys, so do fill that out. And then sometimes there'll be expression of interest opportunities where you can get involved with their upcoming housing projects and have the opportunity to get you a house. And then the second piece of the homework is if you are a shareholder in Māori land, which that might be your whānau trust or it might be one of your parents, the next step is to find out what lands you have shares in and who administers them. So Pātaka is a really great tool. It used to be called Māori Land Online. And if you're not already actively engaged, go on there, find out your land holdings, get in touch with those trusts, give them your contact details, start going to meetings. It might be a trickier road than the iwi route because the iwi have got sometimes resources to do really great projects. I think, you know, if you're not already plugged in, there's a really great opportunity there to share your skills and knowledge and be part of building something really great. Does a Papakāinga need to be designed by a Māori architect? Because honestly, there doesn't seem to be that many of you around. That is true, but there are definitely some. And I guess my answer is not necessarily, but let me unpack what I mean by that. So I think when it comes to Papakāinga, the best outcome is if you're able to work with someone who has whakapapa to your whānau, hapū, or iwi. That is not always possible because you might not have any architects in your whānau, hapū, or iwi. And the next best thing would be to work with a Māori architect who has some good skills and sensitivities around cultural requirements and can work with you to facilitate a really great process and a great design outcome. Failing that, because I appreciate that, you know, there's only so many of us, I think finding an architect, regardless of their ethnicity or cultural background, who really understands and cares about your kaupapa, is really invested in the community that they're working with and are able to walk with you on this journey, because these can be quite a long journey. And you're going to have to live with the decisions you make together. And so the design process is really important. I love this vibe, but I'm Pākehā, a Papakāinga only for Māori. Cool. This is a great question, because I think, for New Zealand Pākehā often feel very connected to the natural environment, the communities they live in, to Māori culture as well. And so you might look to Papakāinga and say, well, I'd love this for my own whānau, and I think it has a lot to offer. And I totally agree. I would say that Papakāinga is really a term reserved for living on ancestral land with related people. So I will say that, if you're a Pākehā in-law, go for it. That's your whānau too. But for those of us who are not Māori but want to, live in this way, and when our families are not necessarily Māori, a really great option is something like co-housing. So we've got some really fantastic examples of co-housing in Aotearoa, including Co-House in Grey Lynn, which is a bit of a mixed community made up of people of various cultural backgrounds. And it has many of the same qualities as Papakāinga, but the key difference is that the people there are not necessarily related to each other, and they don't necessarily whakapapa or have genealogical connections to that land. But what it does have in common is that people have been united around a shared kaupapa. They really want to live more closely together. They want to share resources. They want to be more environmentally conscious. And so some of these co-housing developments have amazing fleets of bikes and big bike storage areas, because everyone rides cargo bikes with their kids, and really the desire to be kind of meaningfully embedded in a community is something that I think everyone can relate to. Ka pai. Well, this has been Kāinga Matters. I hope I've given you a few things to think about and some homework. Ka ra whiua.